Welcome to ePODstemology.
Epistemology. You know what I like a lot more than materialistic things? Knowledge. What is this?
It's a podcast. Hey, welcome to ePODstemology with your boy, Dr. Mark Fabian. This is the Apex podcast for the individual who is easily bored but also thoughtful. My guest today is Sonia Arakkal, founder of Think Forward, an advocacy group for young Australians. Sonia also has experience as a management consultant, political staffer, think tank researcher, and a musical producer. She joins us to talk about all things intergenerational, from trends in popular culture to taxation policy and the fairness of the retirement system. Enjoy! ePODstemology.
So, hi Sonia, thanks for joining me on ePODstemology, our podcast about like knowledge and stuff. So today we're talking about all things intergenerational. So I thought maybe to get started, we should define some of the key generations that we're going to talk about. So we're going to be talking about Zoomers, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and then whatever comes after the Boomers. Is it
the silent generation?
Oh, the silent generation. That's nice. Okay, so from your point of view, what do you think kind of defines these different generations?
Beyond age brackets, which everyone knows about, I think an interesting way of thinking about what defines a generation is looking at what are the worldwide events or moments in history that was a universal experience for each generation. So for the silent generation, those over 80, it's things like the World War. For the baby boomer generation, it is the unprecedented economic growth of the 80s and 90s. For millennials, it's things like the global financial crisis and climate change. And for Zoomers, it's going to be the coronavirus pandemic. Now, each of these generations have experienced these events in often formative years of their life that then influence the way they think, the way they act, and the way they even respond in an economy. So that's one way of thinking about how generations differ. And I think these kind of moments in history impact on the values that generations have. The generations are subcultures, and it's not something that we're comfortable talking about in the context of critical theory or even observing culture. Like we talk about class, we talk about race, we talk about gender, but looking at issues through a generational lens is something that we're still not used to doing, even though to me, I think it's one of the most important ways of analyzing what's happening in our world right now.
Okay, cool. All right, I like that. Right, so let's just do the age thing first, just before we move on from that. So the like decadal brackets that correspond to each of these generations. So I guess we'll start with ourselves. So like I'm an old millennial, I guess, and you're just a regular old millennial, and then there's like young millennials.
Yeah.
And I guess the millennials are the 90s kids, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so born like 85 and onwards.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, nice. And then, so after us is the Zoomers. So that's noughties kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then before us is Gen X. That's the 80s generation, defined by the AIDS epidemic. And then we have Boomers is kind of late 60s and 70s.
Exactly. And the silent generation is over 80s.
Yeah, right. Okay. And they lived through the war. That's kind of the main thing. And then Boomers is this really big block, like post-war generation, grew up in the 60s and 70s. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're the children of the war, or the kind of I guess the silent generations. They lived with the trauma of the silent generation, but not through it. And I guess they're called baby boomers because the silent generation went crazy after the war.
Yeah, had a lot of babies. One thing that I've often thought maybe defines the boomers, and my dad says this a lot, and he's a boomer. But my dad's a bit different because he grew up in communist Hungary. But he thinks that the kind of cultural tropes that we associate with boomers in the US, in particular, and in Australia to some extent, and in the UK where I am now, certainly applied kind of in general across Europe. And his view is that one of the key things that's often overlooked about the boomers is that their parents' generation took a very laissez-faire attitude to the values that they inculcated in their kids, because in a sense they feel like they'd fucked up. So they're like, well, look, we had World War I, then the Depression, then World War II. We're not going to tell you what to do. Just kind of like do what you want. And like, I'm sure that's not entirely true. Like, I'm sure there was still plenty of, strong Christian parents or whatever all over the place. But I think it's maybe important to recognize that part of why you could have the great cultural revolution of the 60s with free love and women's lib and all this kind of stuff and the civil rights movement is because the older generation was like, yeah, whatever. It's like, I'm not going to hazard an opinion here. Whereas at the moment, I think there's also quite a big intergenerational contest, both economically and culturally. But the older generations are very dug in and absolutely have strong opinions about what's okay and what's not.
I've made up my mind.
So have I.
I made up mine first. I'm older and wiser than you, and just do what you're told for once.
Do you have any reactions to that?
Oh, totally. They created the structure that they so badly wanted from their parents' generation. And a really good show that I think really captures what you've just said is Mad Men. I don't know if you've seen it, but sure. It's a great example of how the silent generation parented and resulted and lived through the Cultural Revolution.
She's a child. She'll get over it.
And I think it's a nice little snapshot of how parenting has changed, but also how generational, the kind of parenting values of each generation forms the next. And I totally agree with that analysis. And it's interesting because in the same way that the silent generation post-war birthed the Cultural Revolution, I'm really seeing now that the millennial generation or Gen X are birthing very conservative zillennials. And I'm not sure where that comes from or how we can analyze how Gen X and millennial parents have resulted in these young people that are very structured and conservative about their values. And I don't use the word conservative in terms of being anti-progressive. They're very progressive, but the way that they interact with their ideas and values is quite different, I think, to the way the millennial generation did. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that Gen X parenting has led to a society that is led to things like safe culture or cancel culture that is arguably a really conservative trend in society?
So would you associate cancel culture and wokeism and that sort of thing with the zillennials rather than millennials?
I would, with the zillennials, I think that's the right word, which is the younger millennials and the Zoomer generation. Yes. Okay. I don't think that, I think maybe woke culture was us in the, late 2010s, but what we're seeing now is different to what I experienced at university. And this is all anecdotal, this is my observational take, but I like to think I'm informed because I live on TikTok and I consume it obsessively.
Yes, we're very online.
Obviously.
The only reality is virtual. If you're not jacked in, you're not alive.
Yeah, which makes me Zoomer expert, or at least a millennial Zoomer expert. But I do think it's very different how young people today relate to their values. We were very relativist in our approach, millennials, I think, but the young generation coming through are not. And that isn't to say it's a bad thing, but it's a very big difference, similar to kind of what we were talking about earlier with how the post-war generation, well, similar in the sense the opposite of, but the product of the same kind of parenting tropes or structures.
Right. Okay, yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts on this, but maybe just before we get to those, let's just spend a little bit more time on this parenting idea, just fleshing that out, because I think that is quite important. So I kind of posited that the silent generation were very kind of relaxed parents in terms of the cultural values that they emphasized because they had the wars and the depression, and they were like, well, we don't have any authority. And then the boomer generation, one comment that's often made is that the way they parented the millennials was this kind of helicopter parenting style, and that we were always kind of pushed to be the best we could be, and we're all special snowflakes and unicorns, and we all breathe rainbows. And so as a result of that, the millennial generation is often seen, at least in these kind of elite circles, as very neurotic, and very kind of needs their self-esteem managed, and this kind of stuff, and that, you know, we're always trying to hack ourselves to perfection, and this kind of stuff. Would you agree with that kind of loose characterization?
Oh yeah, we're productivity obsessed,
Okay.
and yeah, we're optimizing, and I think that can be attributed to the economic period that our parents grew up in, which is a time of great wealth, also great competition. And there were obviously periods of recession as they grew up as well, during the early 90s, for example, in Australia, that gave them a sense of insecurity as parents about the abundance around them, that they instilled in their children as neuroticism and this obsession with productivity, because they know what wealth they can get, but also how much it is at risk in the systems and the economies in the way that we've set them up. I'm not going to use the word capitalism, but I think the neuroticism of millennials, it has to be understood in the economic context of our parents' generation, and what was so much to be won for them, but also what was so much to be lost. And probably, as you kind of said before, a reaction to the lack of structure they got.
This might be a bit of a tangent, but this is my favorite topic, so I'm very happy to take this tangent. So about where this conservative zillennial comes from. And I really liked your characterization that we don't mean conservative here in the sense that they have very kind of traditional values, or, you know, we see that the zillennials are typically extremely progressive in that they're very pro-trans, very pro-LGBTIQ, very in favor of kind of quite radical efforts on racial equality and that sort of thing. It's rather that they're conservative about the fact that they sort of hold these values quite absolutely, that they reject relativism, which was a real characteristic of millennials. Like, we are the 90s generation, which so actually my partner and I were rewatching Buffy the Vampire Slayer recently, which is a kind of iconic 90s piece of pop culture.
This is the 90s, the 1990s in point of fact, and I can do both. Clark Kent has a job. I just want to go on a date.
And what's really striking about it is just the fashion is so postmodern. Like, it's all very pastiche. It's kind of deliberately ugly. It's this real kind of mashup of gross things.
Look at his jacket. He's got the sleeves rolled up. And the shirt? Deal with that outfit for a moment.
And yeah, that's very postmodern. Like, you know, what even is beauty? Let's just like try whatever. Whereas I don't think we see that today. And so my opinion on this, and I think this will be a regular theme of ePODstemology, is that this is a part of meta-modernity, and I'm hoping to have a whole podcast on meta-modernity later. So meta-modernity is a combination of modern tropes and postmodern tropes. So modern is the kind of, I guess, immediate post-war idea that, okay, so we torched everything and we had fascism and like that was really bad. But now we're going to like rebuild it in a kind of utopian way. We're committed to humanist values, just through the application of reason and the application of humanism. We can forge a better world. And so out of this, you get like the human rights architecture globally, and you also get a lot of kind of really weird architecture, like the Barbican in London, and things like that. But there's this basic idea that humanism and rationality and can combine to give us kind of very effective notions of beauty and truth and goodness and these kind of things, and they can guide our public policy. And then postmodernism is like, nah, man, that's all bullshit. Basically, it's all power. And just if something is currently in vogue, or presented as good or presented as healthy or whatever, it's quite possible that it's just serving whoever's currently in power, and you can't really get away from this power. And so everything kind of really collapses into relativism in postmodernism, and it's much more about like values are just kind of ascribed by whoever has cultural power, or whoever has literal power or economic power or whatever it might be. And so we don't have any kind of objective foundations, objective normative foundations for how we should run our society and what it means to live well. And I think basically my view, and I think the view that is inherent to metamodernity, is that postmodernism is correct. And you know, that's spicy to say to anyone with religious beliefs, but like the universe does not have values in it that we can discover by doing research or whatever. It's rather that we bring value to the universe. And then I think metamodernity is this kind of acceptance that this postmodern trope is real, like that we can't say that our way is better than your way. But we still want to create value. We still want to feel like our lives are meaningful. We still want to participate in thick culture, this kind of stuff. And so metamodernity is like, well, I'm not going to impose my values on you, but like, I think this is cool, so I'm just going to put it out into the world. And then if you think it's cool, you should join me in also putting this value out into the world. Yeah, so one really great example of this recently was, I don't know if you're familiar with Xkcd comics.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was this amazing story where, so Xkcd is this kind of stick figure comic book series. I'll splice something into the video so people know what I'm talking about. And he made this video about this guy has this dream, and in it he like meets this woman in this universe that's tearing apart, and she whispers something in his ear, and then she disappears and the dream's over. And he wakes up and he remembers what she put in his ears. It's just a series of numbers, and he writes them down, and it looks like coordinates and a day of the year at a certain time. And then the next panel of the comic, his mate's like, so what did you do? And he's like, well, I went there. I had to like find out what it was. And what? Nothing. Just because you want it doesn't mean it's true. But, and here's the twist. Then a whole bunch of Xkcd fans went to those coordinates, which was a park in Boston, I think, on that day at that time. And just like thousands of people turned up to this park to celebrate their love of Xkcd. And I think that's an amazing articulation of metamodernity. So I kind of see this Zillennials thing as an aspect of that, where people are like, well, these are our values and we're happy to like go into bat for them really hard. And there's a bit of a mess that Peterson and other people have kind of picked up on, that this seems to be both postmodern in the sense that it's like there's no gender, there's no sex or whatever, and also quite Marxist in the sense that it's like these people are in power and we need to like change the power structures and stuff. But I wouldn't expect culture to be super coherent. But in any case, my explanation for why people are much more emphatic about their values is that the vacuum that we had in the 90s, where it was kind of like no clear guidance on what was good or bad, is really unpleasant for people. No one likes that. And so the new generation, just as you said, with the boomers creating the structure that they didn't get from their parents, I think the new generation is creating this kind of thick value 100%. System. Yeah, that resonates with me. Okay, great.
For sure. And I would push it a little bit further or kind of maybe give a specific example of the lack of religion that our generation or how our generation really just analyzed ourselves out of religion and out of a lot of the traditional places that we would have gone for culture. Like, you know, we don't join clubs and societies, the community football club, the local knitting group in the way that our parents probably did or our grandparents did. And I think those institutions, especially religious institutions that don't publicly articulate values on our behalf, on an individual's behalf in terms of what they represent or what they believe in, explains how this conservative or this value driven culture of the Zillennials is so different to how we express our values. And I think millennials kind of deconstructed that and didn't ascribe to it, and zillennials have found a new way, as you just said, of doing that. And I think you can't underplay, and this is, I think mainly for Western society, and a response for millennials in the Western civilization have needed a new kind of culture to bring them together and guide them, and they are making their own, and they are sticking to it, and they are loud about it, and you're either with us or you're against us in a way that we probably haven't seen since Christianity was the guiding force of Western culture. And I think it still is, but I think it's a lot can be there's a lot of similarities in the way previous generations centered themselves around Christianity to the way that zillennials and zoomers are centering themselves around cancel culture, woke culture, their progressive values.
All right, nice, yeah. All right, let's spend just a little bit more time with this. So if we step away from the kind of really hot button political issues that seem to kind of define zillennial activism, what are some of the other cultural or normative touchstones that you think the younger generations are currently organizing themselves around? And I don't mean politically, I more kind of mean, so gender, for example, like I think there's clearly quite a large shift in how we think about femininity and masculinity, what women expect from men, this kind of stuff.
Men, I don't know why we put up with them.
So I don't know if you want to talk about gender, but is there anything like that you think really kind of defines some of these new wave values?
I think maybe you need to get a 18-year-old on the podcast next
Yeah.
to really able to answer that question. But as an observer, first of all, let me say, I think our generation has failed the world. Like I really look to Zoomers and see that the way they organize, as you said, around issues that they care about is so inspirational to me. And, that's, I guess, obvious when you look at young people like Greta Thunberg. And
I'll try to get her on the podcast next.
Yeah, good idea. But to go back to my primary source, TikTok, it's not just, it's a real kind of distinctive feature of Zoomers is how they organize around issues. And that fills me with hope for the world. And it fills me with, I guess, a lot of comfort to know that these are the young people that will change the world in the way that we need, because me and my generation have failed to do that. Maybe we still have a bit of time left. Maybe we'll redeem ourselves in our 40s and 50s, but I highly doubt it. I think the Zoomer generation will be the one that, has the revolution, the cultural, economic, otherwise, that we will benefit from, but we won't be the architects of. In terms of gender, I really see this in the gender conversation. We really worked through a lot of the gender stuff. We did a lot of the hard work, and the Zoomers picked it up and they've run with it, and they have implemented it in their lives. In a silly example, I think, is the skinny jeans trope. So we're always getting in trouble because millennials wear skinny jeans and Zoomers wear mum jeans. And just the practicality of it, the fact of, how they dress in a way that is comfortable for them, that is also quite gender neutral. Like if you look at the way, mum jeans sit on a human body, whether it's a man or a woman, it doesn't emphasize their genitalia in a different way, in the way that, for example, skinny jeans would. And it's kind of a symbol of how they've erased gender in their everyday life. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that's something that you can see in, haircuts, in hair colors. And we're talking about a very specific type of, or a subculture of zillennials, but I think they are kind of the new phenomenon. You also have what we had in our millennial generation, like the Kim Kardashian style of young person that will continue to be there. But I think the young progressive millennials are very different to young progressives in our generation. And fashion is one example of how the gender element permeates all their values. from how they dress to, I guess how they interact on LinkedIn. I'm sure you've seen it's pretty normal now to put your pronouns. I go to meetings with young people and we start off by saying I go by she, her, they, them, him, her. And, it's another really we talked about what gender meant and how it was constructed, but we never tipped over to implementing it in our everyday lives in the way that young people do today. So I like that about them, that, they don't just talk about their values or analyze and dissect them in the way that maybe we did. They find ways of practically applying them.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to think about whether, so I think the millennial sort of neurosis around hacking yourself to perfection and kind of being obsessed with productivity and like, am I using every minute of every day to like maximally improve myself, is kind of a bit self-absorbed.
This is all about me. Me.
I guess our generation is increasingly realizing that even if you get, I don't know, you do really well, you touch perfection, you still like not very satisfied. And I mean, I think that relates to a lot of quite well-established ideas in psychology that a lot of feelings of well-being are actually associated with pro-sociality and doing things for other people and creating value, and that meaning and purpose is really important. And we kind of associated meaning and purpose with self-actualization and career success and these kind of things. And I don't want to speak against those. Like, I think they are potentially quite important, but it does seem like the next generations coming through are a little bit more focused on kind of changing the world and the impact that they make collectively, rather than how much they express their individuality, as it were. But maybe I'm kind of reading too much into it.
A great example of this is, I think the younger generation are much more interested in other people's safety. And it's not about identity politics for them. It's about creating safe places. And I think often these two things get conflated as the same thing. And I think they both come from the same value. But again, it's an example of, we talked about identity and deconstructed it and self-actualization. And as you've just acknowledged, it was self-centered. But again, the Zoomers have gone and they've taken it to be something beyond the individual and created communities around it. And now we see this discussion of safe space. I think that's a big difference in how they are living out the values that we cottoned onto, but they are, again, implementing.
Okay, that's really interesting. All right, that was a nice kind of positive twist on, I think, a lot of the things that are usually criticized in Zillennials. I think I'm quite sympathetic to a lot of those criticisms, but I'm also very sympathetic to what you just said. So I think that creates quite a nice picture of things. All right, so I think now we have a good sense for what these generations are, and we want to move on and start talking about some of these more economic and political issues that you've been active in your role within Think Forward. So maybe let's start with this question. So you guys talk a lot about the intergenerational bargain. And I guess we've already touched a little bit on intergenerational bargains around structure and values and things like that. So what do you think the current intergenerational bargain is?
So in sociology and economics, when we talk about the generational contract or generational bargain, it's the quite kind of sensible idea that when people are young, they get looked after by the middle generation, by their parents. When they grow old, when the parents grow old, the young people look after them. And society is structured in this process of mutual care that is actually a really beautiful thing, that, we look after our young when they need help, and we look after our elderly, and the middle generation often carries the burden of doing both. So if we start from that point, what Think Forward is concerned about currently is that the transfers that are being made between the young and the old are getting out of balance with the way they historically have. So currently, for example, young working people are putting much more into the economy than older people had during their young working lives or currently are in their retirement. Now, to a certain extent, that's sensible, right? Older people aren't working, so they shouldn't be putting more. But what we've got is a situation where the balance has tipped to the point where young people are subsidizing the lives of older people at a time where their quality of life is going down. And, you know, you can look to, for example, the Australian Actuarial Intergenerational Index. So the Australian Actuaries Institute came up with an index. And it's an important part of the story is that they had 5, you know, indicators. It was health, education, social, climate, and economic. And in terms of health, millennials are doing better. In terms of social, millennials are doing better. In terms of education, millennials are doing better. But if actuarial nerds are telling you that, you know, on an economic indicator that young people aren't doing better than previous generations on climate and their kind of financial well-being, then I believe them, because, you know, actuaries don't mess around. So there's empirical evidence to kind of support this. The Grattan Institute does a lot of work in this area. But that aside, I think you can look at the young people around you and look at things like the rate of mental health issues. So it's a huge thing right now. Everyone's talking about mental health. Government love funding youth mental health. But what we're not seeing are some of the social determinants of mental health, which are things like secure housing. They're things like wage growth or secure jobs. It's things like adequate safety net. It's things like being able to benefit from the tax system more than you put in. And it's these things you can see around you every day. Home ownership rates going down, the insecurity of renters in Australia, like all of this contributes to youth mental health. And as a country, we've become very comfortable talking about the youth mental health crisis or mental health crisis. But what we haven't done is take that step further and look at what is causing some of these issues. And that's why I think Forward exists, to kind of break down especially from an intergenerational lens, that glad that everyone's cottoned on that youth mental health is a thing, but now let's look at how we revise housing policy in a way that means that young people have secure housing, whether that's renting or buying their own home, as a way of addressing this. Or, you know, let's look at some of the tax incentives we give to older people, like the seniors and pensioners tax offsets, franking credits, how superannuation is taxed. How do these settings impact young people and their long-term financial well-being and therefore their mental health?
Yeah, lovely.
How does, you know, insecure work, low wage growth, the gig economy affect young people and their mental health? So Think Forward basically talks about everything nobody wants to talk about: superannuation, tax reform.
So there's a lot in your comments that I want to pick up on, and we can try to unpack over the next few minutes. So one thing I wanted to talk about was this idea that you said right at the beginning there, that in a sense, millennials are starting to subsidize not the sort of basic needs and care of the older generations, but in a sense, like the lifestyle of the older generations. You know, so like we feel like we're living in small apartments in sort of overpopulated cities, working tough jobs with limited job security and that sort of thing, in order for boomers to live in large houses in lovely suburbs and I think this is the critical thing, collect pensions or collect kind of untaxed superannuation payments that allow them to live just like a really glorious lifestyle. And I think one kind of reply to this that I do tend to come across from boomers is two things. So one is that, well, we, the children, will inherit all of this, which I think is very unfair to migrants, who are like particularly a large group in Australia. But in any case, like, you know, it's all lovely and well if we inherit property, but if we've already kind of raised our kids in small flats in the meantime because our parents are living for so long, then, you know, we've gone through a very substandard midlife, and our children have been raised not in ideal environments, so that we've kind of missed the important boat. The other thing that I sometimes hear from boomers is that they're not rich. And I think there's this interesting kind of behavioral economics thing here where people have a hard time differentiating between how much wealth they have and how much income they have. So I remember reading an article in the Australian Financial Review where they were talking to a postman, a retired postman. So obviously someone who'd been very low income in life. But this guy owned 2 houses, or 2 apartments. So one of his apartments he lived in, and one of his apartments he rented out, and he lived off that rental income. And he was saying that the government should not come after him in terms of reducing the kind of tax incentives he had and franking credits or whatever it was, but should instead, quote, soak the rich. And I was like, well, mate, your apartments are worth like at least $1 million put together. I mean, you could easily sell the apartment that you currently rent and live off the annuity. But this idea that you would sell the property and live off the annuity, or that you would draw down your savings rather than living off the interest, is really just kind of not taken seriously by the older generations. Yeah, so do you have any kind of thoughts on those points?
Man, I'm so excited you asked me these 2 questions.
Fantastic.
Nobody wants to talk about retirement incomes. I don't know why, because to me it's fascinating, but things like superannuation are the real crux of this discussion about the generational contract and how we practice mutual care between the generations and implement it in policy. So I'll come to your second question in a second. But first, in terms of your first point, I think you're absolutely right. It is of no use to us if we inherit wealth in our 50s and 60s. The reality is women have a period in their life that they are childbearing. They have childbearing capacity. And that period of life is when you need resources. That's when you need secure housing. That's when you need a stable job, wage growth, and the funds to care for your children. And so the you'll inherit it anyway argument is of no use to a lot of young millennials who now find themselves starting families. So that's the first response I'd say. It's one, young people are starting families later, they're partnering later, they're buying houses later because of the intergenerational unfairness in our systems. And the solution to that is not wait till you're 50 or 60 to have children, because that just isn't possible. And I think, we were discussing this earlier with your partner about how this has actually resulted in has a cultural impact on millennials, going back to our earlier discussion. And we talked about this pot plant trope of millennials being obsessed with pot plants. And I found that really interesting. For me, I thought it was a performative thing that, we can't do things like own our own home at the age that our parents did, or live in a big garden, so have a property with a big garden. So we surround ourselves with pot plants to perform being an adult. And another good example of this is this whole idea of adulting, and the way that we are very consciously performing adulting, I think, is a symptom of the fact that we realize that we're not doing what at the age of your late 20s or 30s, what previous generations did. We don't have 3 kids. We don't have a home with a big backyard. But going back to what to say to people who bring up the inheritance issue. 1, great, I can't have children when I'm 60 years old. 2, is that the society we want to create? One of landed gentry, like a Jane Austen world where, the success of someone in their life depends on how good property investors their parents were. And I think that's a fundamentally un-Australian thing. And in fact, it's what really distinguishes us from places like the UK or the culture that we originally inherited. So I think this is where there's a really important intersection between intergenerational fairness and intragenerational fairness. And class and generational perspectives clash in a very ugly way when we start with the premise that it's all fine because I'll eventually inherit the family home, or, I'll get the wealth of my parents for investment properties. So I think that's how you should answer next time someone brings that up. In terms of the second point, which I, again, agree with, and unfortunately, my solution to addressing that criticism is a little drier, but read the government's retirement income review that came out in September last year.
Get your books, look stuff up.
It was basically an independent review of our retirement system, which included things like superannuation and the pension. And let me start off by saying, I think it's a really dangerous place to start when we start demonizing the pension, because the problem here is not the pension. The problem is the superannuation system. In fact, if anything, the pension is the one place where we have distributional parts of our retirement system. And so I was very sad to see actually Labor people doing this scaremongering of young people around the pension as a justification for raising super and trying to paint the pension as this big, scary responsibility for us. But if you read the Retirement Income Review, they have very clearly laid out that by 2050, the tax concession associated with the superannuation tax-free threshold will cost more than the pension.
Yeah, way more.
And
no, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And it's because, and the retirement, this is again a government, this is a conservative government, a liberal government report, independent as it is. And they have found that exactly what you described in your question is happening, that people are living on the interest, they are not drawing down on their superannuation. And there is a whole discussion about whether we want to let the superannuation system basically become an estate planning tool, because I can't remember the exact number. Again, I really encourage anyone who's interested in these issues to go to the Retirement Income Review. If you want to skip all the boring bits, there's executive summary, there's a whole section on intergenerational fairness. But in it, it talks about how the amount that people are leaving or bequeathing to their kids of their superannuation is not the design. That's not what it was for. That's not how it was designed. And there is this hesitance to draw down and live off and instead to live off the interest, as you said. And, that's fine. It's absolutely fine for people to make investment decisions in that way. But when we are subsidizing through our tax system,
that's right. Yeah.
An estate planning tool for a system that isn't, distributive at all, I think we have a serious problem. And in fact, one of I can't remember if it was in the Retirement Income Review itself, but one of the things that economists in Australia have been saying is that if we increase superannuation, the amount that we put into it, we're going to create a society that has a better life in retirement than they do during their working lives for young people currently. And that's another example of what we were just talking about, of that generational contract and bargain that is slowly being undermined in Australia.
Yeah, great. So super good content. I particularly like your point that, in a sense, like, it's understandable that people don't want to sell their assets and live off the premium that is so generated. And, we can have sympathy for that, but nonetheless, the younger generation cannot be expected to subsidize an entitlement to that kind of way of living. And I think it's unfortunate that essentially we are being forced to subsidize that kind of thing by a lack of political power, which is something that I do want to come back to later in the podcast. Let's spend a little bit more time on the first half of your response there. I realized I probably should have just put each question to one at a time. So I wanted to pick up on your point about intergenerational versus intragenerational fairness, kind of estate planning and a landed gentry and all this kind of stuff, because I think it intersects with another critical issue here, which is the housing market, which I think is a feature of sort of all OECD economies at the moment. I mean, in Australia, it's particularly wild, but it's obviously a big part of the US and UK dialogues as well, and France and Germany and all the rest of it. So one thing that's long bothered me here is that if the people who end up being able to live in the nice suburbs are the people whose parents had real estate, then that's really pernicious to the experience of migrants. So that's the kind of intra-generational issue, that people who are new to the country, who are overwhelmingly, people of color, people who are unable to work quite as effectively because, they want to have kids or something. So like women just aren't going to be able to access the same lifestyles that other people in their generation are accessing simply through kind of like lotteries of birth. far as I can tell. And I think that the way that this intersects interestingly with the housing issue is through the pushes around zoning and NIMBYism. So often when you kind of bring up the need, I'd say like most millennials, not all, but most millennials are YIMBYs. So yes, in my backyard, got to build. And we're also numbtots. So like, what's the new urbanist memes for transport-oriented teens? So millennials tend to be relatively more in favor of public transport and walkable cities and this kind of stuff, and that sort of form of urban planning. And I think it's interesting that there's been so much staunch opposition from the landed boomer generation against sort of, say, building 8-story apartment blocks along train lines and along rezoning suburban areas to be medium density, especially when they're along the commuter belt. And I often find in that sort of debate is that you point out to people like there is unmet demand for housing and we need to do something about it. And often the reply that you get is that, well, we should just have fewer migrants. And then there wouldn't be quite as much demand on housing. And this is often framed in this, I think, quite perverse way that these people are looking out for our interests. Like everyone has a right to amenity and everyone deserves a garden and stuff like that. And I'm always like, well, one, that ship has sailed. But two, migration is very important to the economic growth of Australia and the UK and the US. And so the millennials who are working hard to pay pensions and pay all these tax cuts for superannuation and that sort of thing really rely on migration rates to sustain economic growth and sustain the kind of economic power of these countries to pay for all of these benefits that older people receive. And then not only do they want to lock us out of the housing market, but then they also want to take out that source of economic growth from under us. Do you have any reactions to that?
Yeah, it's, I think, a really accurate description of a lot of the politics of some of the boomer generation. I'd like to reflect on your first point in terms of the intersectionality of intergenerational perspectives. And I'm glad you brought it up because I get a lot of pushback on it when I talk about intergenerational fairness. I have a lot of people saying, you know, why are you trying to pit the generations against each other? Shouldn't you be talking about race, or shouldn't we be talking about class, or shouldn't we be talking about gender? And I think people also point out, and it's fair to say that, you know, yeah, a whole lot of young people are going to inherit their parents' wealth. And there are a lot of vulnerable old people over the age of 65 who struggle to make ends meet.
Yeah, I'm 100% pro-pension. I really liked your point.
Yes.
So I think, yeah, we need to be all about the pension, not about kind of massive tax breaks on superannuation for people who were in that 8th or 9th decile of household income through most of their earning years.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. And I'd love to come back to this point because I think a lot of retirement income and some of the problems we have with transforming it have to do with these notions of a worthy poor and who are worthy poor in society. But we'll come back to that later. In terms of what you were asking about, you know, the intersection of like migrants and generational lens critiques on things, the point still stands, even if there are young people who will be well off and older people who struggle, that if a generation as a whole does badly, opportunities for social mobility for the poor in that generation are even worse.
Yeah.
And in fact, if a generation does relatively well, the inheritances they leave increase inequality in their children's generation. So actually looking at the generational dimension of inequality helps address things like class, gender, and race, and the migrant issue you brought up. I mean, I'm not really expert on, you know, I guess on the economics behind migration and how that intersects with the housing market, but I can speak from anecdotal experience. So I'm currently living in Perth and there is a rental crisis. There is a housing crisis. My husband and I were offering $50 more than the asking price, listing price on properties, 6 months rent up front, and we still were not getting a place to live. And, you know, we are two young professionals who have the privilege of being able to offer that, let alone on a lot of the Facebook groups I'm on, I'm seeing people come out there and say, I'm giving birth in 3 weeks. I need a place for me and my daughter to live. Or I'm a single father of 4. I can't find a 3-bedroom apartment in a 3-bedroom house in an outer ring suburb to live.
Yeah.
And the vacancy rates in Perth right now are 0.9%. That is the lowest on record.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the vacancy rates in Melbourne are 14%.
Yeah.
So
I guess just for context, we should mention
I bring
that
this up to illustrate, for Perth at least, and that's all I can speak to, we haven't had migration, as in migrants coming from overseas, in over a year, and we have this property crisis.
Yeah, right.
This rental crisis. So I guess I bring it up to just agree with your analysis on it, and to say that the crisis we have is supply side issues. It's zoning, it's perverse tax incentives like land taxes that we haven't tried to address that. So it is kind of maybe try that first and then turn to migration, because, you know, I think it's fair to point out that migration increases demand, but if we also acknowledge that we need migrants.
Yeah, cool. I want to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say, I don't want to spare developers from wrath either. So I think part of the issue with the supply crisis is that governments release a lot of land to developers, and then developers land bank it, which means that they don't develop that land, because if they did develop it rapidly, then they would create a supply side response, and that would bring down the price of housing. And they don't want to do that, so they kind of sit on it to maximize their profits. I also want to emphasize that I think, like most numbtots and NIMBYs who think that the solution to the housing crisis is to just build, I'm not necessarily opposed to social housing. I think the government should build a lot of housing. I think it should be affordable. I'm not opposed to all sorts of other stuff like that. If it's going to build housing, I'm probably in favor of it. I find that a lot of the comments in this space kind of get sidetracked into problems around, like building luxury apartments isn't affordable for people. But building luxury apartments does bring rent down in the neighborhood. But even setting that aside, like, okay, build luxury apartments, build social housing, build other house, whatever, just build it.
Yeah. And kind of going back to your postman who had one investment property, like, I mean, to me, that's okay. I have more issue with those that have 4 or 5 and use it as this kind of unchecked investment that is of guaranteed returns in a way that you wouldn't if you were investing in the stock market. Like part of the problem, you know, I think a private rental market is always going to be a part of our system. And it is a reality that it's going to be important that we keep that private rental market in addition to more social housing going, because as we've just discussed, the reality is a lot of young people aren't going to be owning their own homes and going to be lifelong renters. And so, you know, I guess in addition to social housing and a healthy private rental market, it's giving the rights to those people. I love that you brought up the 2 meme groups. What were they? Numbtots and urban teens. Urban
Numbtots
teens.
is new urbanist memes for transport-oriented teens. It's an excellent memeing community. Yeah.
Amazing. And I have a theory about this. Like, you know how we have the pop intellectual tradition? In the 90s, it was like pop psychology, right? And everyone was reading pop psychology. And then I think in the like early 2000s or 2010s, it was very much pop economics, like Malcolm Gladwell, you know? And I think the current trend is pop urban planning. The reason I know is because Monocle has put out a Building Better Cities book. And, you know, if the Monocle are putting out a book on it, it's definitely the intellectual trend, and that's urban planning. Right. And I think if you look at the pop trends over the last, the 3 that we've just talked about, it tells you something about the generations of the time. The, you know, millennial, the kind of Gen X baby boomers with their pop psychology, us productivity obsessed millennials with pop economics, and now Gen Z can't afford to, you know, live in cities, or they're living in 4-story apartments in a tiny one bedroom in London or Melbourne or wherever, that are fascinated by pop urbanism. So maybe we should add that to the description of generations that we had earlier.
Yeah, that's a good one. So I think your comments there really bring us into maybe the last big theme that I want to talk about, which is kind of visions for the future and what it would mean for a government to take seriously the needs of the younger generations and what sort of new intergenerational compact we can forge. So I just want to list off a few things that Think Forward has put up as kind of what it expects from politics. So affordable and secure housing, a superannuation system that doesn't disadvantage young people and entrench inequality between the generations, taxation and social welfare policies that don't overwhelmingly favour older generations. And then you've emphasised adequate planning for the future and meaningful action on climate change and environmental responsibility. Sustainability. So I think we've covered off a lot of that. But maybe what I want to pick up on is the last two, the future of work and meaningful action on climate change, because I think both of these point to kind of like thinking forward, as your group is called. So what kind of things would you like to see on those two fronts from political parties?
I'm going to be straight with you, Mark. The environmental conversation is not one that we are active in terms of our research and in terms of our kind of political lobbying. There are so many organizations around Australia that do that really well. Fair. But the reason, obviously, as millennials, like, we think it's a problem and something that we need to plan for. I guess my thought on this area is that I think almost the climate change movement has come at the cost of the millennial generation being self-interested. And not advocating for their self-interest. So for us, it's really important that we tie the kind of sustainability of our systems, whether that be superannuation, tax, housing, to the environmental issue, not just for environmental outcomes, but also for the self-interested outcomes of the millennial generation, if that makes sense. So I think millennials feel, or a lot of young people feel like they can't be self-interested in the way that they talk about political issues because there's bigger fish to fry, like global warming and climate change. Yeah. But I think Forward's interest in this is from trying to connect, especially for young people, the relationship between sensible economic outcomes for you as an individual and for younger and future generations with environmental outcomes. Like, one of the reasons we've been able to so kind of happily, relatively speaking, go through the coronavirus pandemic in Australia is because our economy was in somewhat of a shape to be able to do that. If we don't keep investing in making our economy the best it can be, the most sustainable it can be, not just for the current crisis, but for future crisis, should sea water levels rise and we have an environmental crisis on our hands, we may not have the same economic resources to be able to respond like we have to the coronavirus crisis. So for us, it's very important that when young people are out there talking about climate change, they also don't forget to talk about their own financial and economic well-being, because one of the big reasons that young people don't get cut through politically is because they don't organize in the way that older people do. Self-funded retirees organize themselves really well. The Council of the Aged is a great organization that does important work advocating for the interests of older people. And mind you, they're funded by government as well. Right. Seniors Australia. There is a whole there's a whole rich tapestry of advocacy happening based on age for older Australians, from aged care to the superannuation system to investment systems that doesn't exist at a younger level. Like, we have a lot of organizations talking about climate change, but we don't have as many talking about the kind of economic context within which we need to thrive to be able to address climate change in the future.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Really rich comments. So, all right, we've gone on for a while, and I think it's been a really fantastic talk. So let's try to wrap it up into one kind of final question. So Think Forward has said that younger generations have kind of expectations from political leaders. You mentioned ensuring opportunity and participation in the economy, guaranteeing social well-being, having a voice at the table. And then here's the one that I guess I want to finish off with, which is a vision for the future. So I'm wondering, just sort of anecdotally or just off the top of your head, so what are some kind of tropes of this vision for the future that you think millennials could get behind? Like, what sort of future do millennials want?
It's an interesting question, because I think we've talked about a lot of them in terms of secure housing. We've talked about the self-actualization into not just in your career, but also in the ability to look after a family, to have a family. I would reflect, though, that as Think Forward, we're a group of young people, but we're not very representative. So I often kind of resist speaking on behalf of the whole millennial generation. But in order to kind of address your question, I might talk about what we're currently working on, which is not the answer to your question about what the vision is, but it's a process to get to that vision.
Perfect.
So we are currently lobbying for a parliamentary inquiry into intergenerational fairness, into economic intergenerational fairness in the Senate. And we have this amazing coalition of supporters, from economists to groups like Youth Action in New South Wales, the Youth Affairs Networks in Victoria, WA, Queensland and Tasmania, the Foundation of Young Australians, the list goes on. Basically, we brought all these groups together that play in the youth space. And now a lot of these groups do important work in terms of frontline youth services for our most vulnerable young people. But what we've said to them is, hey, this is something Think Forward wants to do, and it's the more esoteric conversation we need to have about what is the vision in the future, and they're on board. So this idea of a federal parliamentary inquiry is to create a platform for our current leaders to hear directly from young people and millennials, from economists that know things about housing policy, about tax reform, to hear from urban planners about planning. So our vision for the process to get to your answer is that we create this platform, and there are submissions made by experts, by young people who have lived experience, and that out of this would come some kind of recommendation about what this vision is for the future. I'm really excited about this project because I think it goes, one, to answering your question, but also it's important for it to be a kind of participatory thing. I think that there's global precedent for this as a form. And like, I know people often roll their eyes in terms of parliamentary
I'm doing this
inquiries.
work in Cambridge right now.
Yeah, and I think, and I understand why people roll their eyes, but unfortunately, in the intergenerational fairness conversation in Australia, we are so far behind that this is the kind of small goal that we've set ourselves that will kind of, as a society, allow us to level up in the national narrative about how we create this vision for young people. And in fact, in the UK, where you live, the House of Lords, after the global financial crisis in the end of 2009, they established an inquiry into intergenerational fairness. And that was supported by people in the House of Lords. It came out with a report. Government responded to it. It had some crazy stuff out there. They were like, let's give every young person under the age of 25 who suffered under the global financial crisis £25,000. And, why our inquiry, we're hoping, will look at things like, should we top up the superannuation savings of all the young people that took out money during the coronavirus pandemic? The House of Lords inquiry looked at kind of the systems we set up, like, how do we look at the impact of economic decisions in our parliamentary budgeting? Do we need a commissioner of intergenerational fairness like they have in Wales? In Australia, there used to be something called the Women's Statement. Do we have the intergenerational statement? So excitedly, just at the beginning of this year, actually, following on from the House of Lords work on the intergenerational fairness inquiry, Lord Bird, I think his name is, introduced a bill into the UK Parliament called the Intergenerational Fairness Bill. And so these are the kind of process outcomes that Think Forward is working toward to kind of progress the conversation in Australia so that we can get to a point of articulating a vision that isn't just us in our corner talking about it, but has buy-in from people who can make it a reality, our politicians.
Yeah, great. I mean, I don't think that's a small goal at all. I think that's very ambitious. So my girlfriend tells me that all podcasters need to have this kind of like final little mini question that they ask people. So like Ezra Klein asked people like, what are 3 books that you've read recently that you'd recommend to people? And I haven't been able to come up with something quite so succinct yet, but what I'm hoping to do is talk to people from all sorts of different industries. And you yourself have quite an eclectic background in consulting and political activism and running this lobby group and then think tanking, and then you've also produced a musical. Can you tell us a little bit about what the musical is, just very briefly, please?
It's called Tony Galati the Musical, and it's about the deregulation of potatoes in Perth, Western Australia. Tony Galati was a Sicilian migrant that came to Perth and basically disrupted the establishment and freed the potatoes. He is the Gandhi of potatoes, and my husband and I wrote a musical about it.
Amazing. Can you still get tickets? Are you guys still on show or anything?
So we've had 2 seasons in 2019 and 2020, and at the end of this year, we're doing a regional tour. So if you are going to Harvey, Albany, Karratha, or Exmouth in rural Western Australia, you can get a ticket.
Okay, thanks very much, Sonia. This has been a tremendous conversation, so rich. We've ranged across TikTok, culture, economics, political advocacy, all the rest of it. I hope the listeners enjoy it as much as we did recording it. And I'll let you go. Thanks very much for your time.
Great. Thanks, Mark. What fun to talk. I really enjoyed that.
Cheers. Bye now.